The story begins on a dusty road in ancient Israel, a land groaning under spiritual drought long before the skies ever dried up. People had drifted far from God, chasing idols that glittered for a moment, but left their hearts emptier than before. In the middle of this silence, in the middle of this spiritual collapse, a man suddenly appeared. No introduction, no childhood story, no warm build-up. He walked out of the mountains of Gilead with the boldness of a thunderstrike. His name was Elijah. He wasn't polished or royal. His clothes were rough, stitched from animal hair. His voice carried the tone of someone who lived closer to the wind than to men. And when he stepped into the palace of King Ahab, the guards didn't stop him. Maybe it was the fire in his eyes. Maybe it was something in the air around him, something that felt like truth. Ahab sat lazily on his throne, a king shaped more by comfort than courage. Jezebel, his queen, had already filled the kingdom with idols and false prophets. People bowed to Baal now, not God. The palace walls echoed with chants that didn't belong to Israel. Elijah walked right up to the throne. He didn't bow. He didn't tremble. He simply said, "As the Lord lives, there will be no dew or rain in this land except at my word." The words dropped like stones in a silent room. Before anyone could question him, Elijah turned around and walked out as boldly as he had walked in. And the heavens shut. Months passed, then years. Crops withered, streams died, and the people began to wonder if Elijah's God had truly spoken. While the land cracked under the heat, God was hiding his prophet beside a lonely brook called Cherith. There, God sent ravens, black-winged messengers, to bring Elijah bread and meat morning and evening. Water trickled through the stones, cool and clean, enough to keep him alive. Elijah's days were simple there. He listened. He waited. He learned what silence sounds like when God is in it. But the drought grew deeper, and the brook finally shrank to nothing. Elijah knelt beside the dry bed, touching the last damp stone, and God spoke again. "Go to Zarephath. I've commanded a widow there to feed you." So Elijah traveled north into a foreign land, stepping into a town where hunger lived in every house. At the gate he saw her, a thin woman gathering sticks, her movements slow, tired. He asked her for water, and she turned to fetch it. But when he asked for bread too, she stopped. She looked at him with eyes that held both pain and exhaustion. "I have only a handful of flour," she whispered, "and a little oil. I was gathering these sticks to make one last meal for me and my son, then we will die." Elijah felt his heart twist, but his voice stayed steady. "Do not be afraid. Make me a small loaf first. Then make something for yourself and your child. For the Lord says the flour will not run out, and the oil will not dry up." It didn't make sense, but the widow obeyed. Maybe it was something in Elijah's voice, something firm, something warm, something that felt like hope in a world that had forgotten hope. And just as God promised, the jar stayed full. The oil kept flowing, day after day, enough to survive. But suffering wasn't done with that house. One afternoon, the widow's son fell sick. His breathing grew shallow, his face pale, and death crept closer until he lay cold in her arms. The widow turned on Elijah, grief cutting through her like a blade. "Did you come to remind me of my sin? Did you come to take my son?" Her words broke Elijah. He took the small body from her arms and carried it upstairs, laying the boy on his own bed. Elijah knelt, tears hitting the blanket. "Lord, please," he whispered, "let this child's life return." He stretched himself over the boy and cried out again, and then again. The room felt tight with sorrow. And then, in a moment as breathtaking as sunrise, the child gasped. Life returned. Elijah carried him down to his mother. Her tears turned from grief to awe. "Now I know," she said, voice trembling, "that the word of God is truth." But far away, in Israel, the famine was reaching its breaking point. Fields had become graveyards for crops. Cattle lay scattered like abandoned shadows. The people stumbled in weakness. Even the king grew restless, pacing through rooms that smelled of incense, but not of hope. Then one day, God spoke again to Elijah. "Go, show yourself to Ahab. I will send rain." The journey back into Israel felt heavy, but necessary. Elijah knew what confrontation looked like. He knew this meeting could end with chains or death. But obedience was his companion, and he walked with it like a friend. On the road, he met Obadiah, a faithful servant of God who had secretly hidden 100 prophets from Jezebel's wrath. When Obadiah saw Elijah, he almost collapsed. "You're alive," he whispered. "Ahab has searched every nation for you. Go tell him I'm here," Elijah said. Obadiah froze. "If I tell him and you disappear again, he will kill me." But Elijah promised he would stay. And so Obadiah carried the message. Ahab rode out to meet Elijah, with anger burning in his eyes. When he saw the prophet, he shouted, "Is that you, the one who troubles Israel?" Elijah didn't flinch. "It's not me troubling Israel," he replied. "It's you, because you abandoned God and followed Baal." Then Elijah made a challenge that would echo through history. "Gather all Israel on Mount Carmel. Bring the prophets of Baal. Let's see who is God." Word spread like wildfire. People climbed the mountain in crowds, desperate for an answer, desperate for a sign, desperate for anything that felt like truth. On one side stood 450 prophets of Baal, dressed in bright colors, chanting loudly. On the other side stood Elijah, alone, dusty, simple. Elijah lifted his voice. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal, then follow him." Silence answered him. So Elijah proposed the test. 2 bulls, 2 altars, no fire. "Call on your God, and I will call on mine. The one who answers with fire is the true God." The challenge lit something in the crowd, a spark of curiosity, maybe hope. The prophets of Baal went first. They prepared their altar and began shouting from morning till noon. "O Baal, answer us." They danced. They cried out. Still nothing. Elijah watched calm. When noon came, he let out a half smile. "Shout louder," he said. "Maybe he's asleep, or traveling, or busy." The prophets grew frantic. They cut themselves, blood mixing with dust. They screamed until their voices cracked. Still nothing. Then Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord with 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. He dug a trench around it. He arranged the wood, placed the bull on top, and then did something wild. He asked them to pour water over everything. Once. Twice. A third time. Water soaked the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even filled the trench. Then Elijah lifted his face to the sky and prayed a simple prayer. "Lord, show them that you are God and that I am your servant." The wind paused, and fire fell. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a flame. It was a fiery flood from heaven that consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the water, everything. The crowd fell to their knees, trembling, shouting, "The Lord, He is God." And for the first time in years, hope sparked in Israel. Elijah turned to Ahab. "Eat, drink, rain is coming." Then Elijah went up the mountain alone. The sky was still bright and empty. He knelt and began to pray. 7 times he sent his servant to look toward the sea. 6 times the answer was the same, nothing. But on the 7th time, the servant whispered, "A small cloud as small as a man's hand." Elijah stood. "Tell Ahab to hurry. The rain will overtake him." And then the sky darkened. Wind roared. The heavens opened. Rain poured in sheets, drenching the land that had forgotten what water felt like. Elijah ran ahead of Ahab's chariot through the storm, lightning flashing around him. His feet hit the soaked earth, but his spirit felt light, almost lifted. Yet this victory wasn't the end of Elijah's journey. The rain that fell over Israel should have brought relief, but instead it stirred something darker inside the palace. Ahab arrived soaked and shaken, the wheels of his chariot splashing mud across the courtyard. Servants rushed to him, but his eyes were empty, as if he had witnessed something he couldn't explain or escape. Jezebel waited inside. She sat upright on her throne, a fierce flame behind her eyes. She didn't care about the drought ending or the rain returning. She cared about power, about control, about the false prophets she had nurtured like weapons. When Ahab told her everything that happened on Mount Carmel, how Elijah had mocked the prophets of Baal, how fire from heaven consumed the altar, how the crowd turned back to God, and how the prophets of Baal were defeated, her anger rose like a storm hotter than any drought. She stood from her throne, every jewel trembling with her fury. "Elijah will die," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through silence. "By this time tomorrow, I will make him like one of them." She didn't shout the threat. She spoke it like a promise, steady, cold, final. A messenger ran through the night and found Elijah resting in a small hut. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth. Elijah had prayed, poured his soul out, called down fire from heaven, and watched rain return to a suffering nation. His body was exhausted, but his heart carried a strange mixture of victory and heaviness. When the messenger delivered Jezebel's words, something inside Elijah broke. He had faced kings. He had faced hundreds of false prophets. He had stood alone on a mountain surrounded by enemies. But Jezebel's threat cut deeper than he expected. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was the sudden shift from triumph to terror. Fear grabbed him, and he ran. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just kept moving, over hills, across valleys, past villages where hungry faces stared from doorways. The rain that once felt like a blessing was now a reminder of the battle he had just won, and the battle waiting to destroy him. He ran until he reached Beersheba, far in the south, almost out of Israel. His servant followed him, worried, breathing heavily. When they reached the edge of the town, Elijah stopped. "Stay here," he said quietly. His voice sounded older, heavy, tired. Then Elijah walked alone into the wilderness. The desert swallowed him. The wind carried sand across his feet, and the sky above him felt painfully wide. Each step made him feel smaller. He had stood on mountains, but now he walked in emptiness. By the time the sun began to set, his strength was gone. He found a solitary broom tree, a scraggly thing, barely tall enough to cast shade. He collapsed under it, leaned his back against its trunk, and whispered a prayer that came from the deepest well of his exhaustion. "Lord, I've had enough." His voice cracked. His hands trembled. "Take my life. I'm no better than my father." It wasn't a dramatic request. It wasn't rebellious. It was the cry of a man who had given everything and felt he had nothing left. He closed his eyes, expecting rest, hoping for escape. But God didn't give him death. He gave him sleep. Elijah drifted into darkness, his breathing slow and soft. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, his mind quieted. He didn't dream of fire or rain or threats. He simply slept. Then a gentle touch woke him. He opened his eyes and saw an angel sitting beside him, calm, peaceful, not blazing with glory, but quiet like early morning light. In front of Elijah was a freshly baked cake of bread and a jar of water. The angel spoke only one sentence, soft, almost tender. "Get up and eat." Elijah obeyed. The warm bread strengthened him. The cool water soothed his dry throat. When he finished, he lay down again, and God let him sleep once more. A second time the angel touched him. "Get up and eat. The journey ahead is too much for you." This time the words felt like a promise, not a warning. Elijah ate again, quieter now, his thoughts beginning to steady. Strength flowed back into his weary limbs. Then he stood and walked. For 40 days and 40 nights he traveled through barren land until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain where Moses once stood, the place where God spoke in thunder and fire. It was a place of beginnings, a place of covenant, a place where hearts were shaped. Elijah found a cave and stepped into its cool darkness. There, in the still air, God's voice came to him, not in anger, not in disappointment, but with a simple question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah's heart opened like a cracked jar. "I've been very zealous for you," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "The people broke your covenant. They tore down your altars. They killed your prophets. I am the only one left, and they're trying to kill me too." He didn't hide his pain. He didn't pretend to be strong. He spoke like a person who had carried too much for too long. God told him to come out of the cave. Elijah stepped toward the entrance. Suddenly, a wind tore across the mountain. Rocks split. Dust spiraled. The earth trembled beneath him. But God wasn't in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the ground, rumbling like thunder beneath his feet. But God wasn't in the earthquake. Then fire blazed across the mountaintop, hot and wild and brilliant. But God wasn't in the fire. After the fire came something else, a sound so soft it felt more like breath than voice. A gentle whisper. Elijah wrapped his cloak around his face. He knew this presence. He felt it deep in his bones. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was love, quiet, steady, unshakable. Again the voice came. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And again Elijah wept out the truth in his heart. This time God answered him with guidance, not rebuke. He gave him instructions, clear steps, new missions, and the promise that the story wasn't ending in a cave. "Go back," God said. "You will anoint new kings, and I have kept 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal." Elijah wasn't alone. He had never been alone. Hope stirred again inside him. Elijah left the mountain with a renewed strength. His steps were steady now, not driven by fear but by purpose. The road stretched wide before him as he traveled north again, back into the land he once fled. On the way, he passed through open fields where farmers tried to rebuild after the drought. In one field, he saw a man plowing with 12 pairs of oxen, a sign of wealth, of strength, of leadership. The man guiding the 12th pair was named Elisha. The moment Elijah saw him, something inside him recognized him, not as a stranger, not as a simple farmer, but as a chosen partner, someone who would walk with him, learn from him, and eventually take up his mantle. Elijah didn't give long speeches. He didn't introduce himself with grandeur. He simply walked up behind Elisha and threw his cloak over him, the symbol of calling, the silent invitation to join God's mission. Elisha froze. The weight of the cloak felt heavier than fabric. It felt like destiny pressing against his shoulders. He left the oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said. "Then I'll come with you." Elijah nodded. "Go back. What have I done to you?" It wasn't a rejection. It was Elijah's way of saying, "This calling is between you and God." Elisha returned home, but only briefly. He slaughtered the oxen, burned his plowing equipment, and served a farewell meal to his family and neighbors. It was his way of saying goodbye to his old life, an act of commitment, full and final. Then he followed Elijah. And from that day on, Elisha became like a son walking alongside a father, learning the ways of God not through lecture, but through shared journeys, shared prayers, shared silence. The days ahead weren't peaceful. Israel continued to battle spiritual confusion. Ahab remained a weak king, easily swayed by Jezebel. In one famous event, Ahab wanted a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth, land Naboth refused to sell because it was his family inheritance. Ahab sulked like a child, lying on his bed, refusing to eat. Jezebel entered the room, her eyes cold with calculation. "Get up," she said. "I'll get the vineyard for you." What she did next was ruthless. She arranged false witnesses. She orchestrated lies. And soon Naboth was killed, and the vineyard was handed to Ahab as casually as a piece of fruit. But God saw everything. He sent Elijah once more, this time not to warn Israel, not to call down fire, but to speak judgment. Elijah found Ahab walking through the stolen vineyard, inspecting it with quiet satisfaction. The king looked up and saw Elijah. His face fell. "So you found me, my enemy," he said. Elijah stepped closer. "I have found you because you sold yourself to do evil. You brought destruction on Israel, and the blood of Naboth cries out." The words struck deep. Ahab, weak as he was, felt the weight of truth. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and humbled himself. And God, in his mercy, delayed the punishment. Not canceled, not erased, but delayed. Yet the darkness Jezebel brought would still have consequences. Her end was written long before it arrived. The days that followed carried a strange stillness, as if the air around Elijah knew something important was approaching. Elisha felt it too, though Elijah never spoke about it directly. There was a tenderness in the way the older prophet walked, as if every step held memory. The road ahead felt different, not like a mission to deliver a message or confront a king, but like a journey with a quiet purpose. One morning, as the sun softened the horizon, Elijah turned to Elisha and said something unexpected. "Stay here. The Lord is sending me to Bethel." Elisha looked at him, hurt flashing across his face. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live," he said, "I will not leave you." It wasn't stubbornness. It was devotion, deep, unwavering, shaped by years of shared calling. Elisha knew something was happening, even if Elijah tried to walk alone. They traveled to Bethel, the ancient town where Jacob once saw a ladder reaching heaven. As they arrived, a group of young prophets, students of God's ways, approached Elisha quietly. "Do you know," they whispered, "that today the Lord will take your master from you?" Elisha's jaw tightened. "I know. Don't talk about it." He wasn't ready to say goodbye. The words felt too heavy to speak. Elijah stood a few steps away, eyes on the road. After a moment he said again, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord is sending me to Jericho." But Elisha's answer didn't change. "As the Lord lives, I will not leave you." So they continued to Jericho. Jericho's prophets came out with the same whispered question. "Do you know your master is going to be taken today?" "I know," Elisha told them. Please keep silent." He wasn't angry. He was grieving in advance. The man who had thrown a cloak over his shoulders, who had taught him to listen for God's voice, who had walked with him through valleys of danger. How could he simply let him go? Yet the journey wasn't over. Elijah looked at him again. "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord is sending me to the Jordan." But again Elisha replied, "I will not leave you." So the two walked on side by side. Behind them followed 50 young prophets from a distance, watching quietly, sensing the sacredness of this final path. When Elijah and Elisha reached the edge of the Jordan River, the water rolled before them, wide and strong. Elijah took off his cloak, the same cloak that once rested on Elisha's shoulders the day he left his plow. He rolled it tightly and struck the water with it. The river split. It didn't splash or churn. It simply opened, its waters pulling back as if bowing to the presence of the prophet. A dry path stretched across the riverbed. Elijah and Elisha walked through the parted waters, their footsteps echoing in a strange quiet. When they reached the other side, the river flowed back into its place, as if it had never moved. The journey had led them to a secluded place, away from crowds, away from noise. Only the two of them stood there, student and master, heart and shadow, past and future. Elijah turned to Elisha, his expression gentle. "Tell me, what do you want me to do for you before I am taken?" Elisha's answer came from the depth of his soul. "I want a double portion of your spirit." It wasn't greed. It wasn't ambition. It was longing to carry the mission forward with strength, to continue what Elijah started, to stand firm where others might fall. He wanted to be the son who carried the father's mantle well. Elijah nodded slowly. "You have asked for a difficult thing, but if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. If you don't see it, then you won't receive it." And then they walked. The breeze rustled through the trees. The sunlight flickered on the ground. The moment felt suspended, sacred. Neither spoke. Sometimes silence says more than words. Then it happened. A sudden roar filled the air, like thunder, but sharper, brighter, alive. Flames appeared, swirling into the shape of horses, fiery, blazing, powerful. A chariot made of fire rushed between Elijah and Elisha, forcing them apart. Elisha stumbled back, eyes wide, heart pounding. The world around him glowed with an otherworldly brilliance. And Elijah began to rise. Not in pain, not in fear, not in struggle. He was lifted as if carried by the breath of God himself. His cloak slipped from his shoulders and drifted down toward Elisha. My father, Elisha cried, his voice breaking. The chariots of Israel and its horsemen. He reached out, but he couldn't touch Elijah. The prophet rose higher, the fiery chariot carrying him upward until the sky swallowed the last trace of him. There was no body, no burial, no grave. Elijah didn't die, he was taken. Elisha fell to his knees, the echo of Elijah's departure ringing in his heart. For a long moment, he stayed there, chest heaving, tears falling silently. The wind that remained felt empty, as if something massive had just passed through it and left a hollow behind. Then he saw it, the cloak. Elijah's cloak lay on the ground, waiting. Elisha picked it up with trembling hands. The fabric felt familiar, heavy, sacred. It carried the scent of dust, rain, and journeys shared. It carried Elijah's calling, his authority, his legacy. Elisha pressed it to his face, trying to breathe in the last trace of the man who had changed his life. Then he stood. He walked back toward the Jordan River, the cloak hanging over his shoulders. The 50 prophets watched from afar, unsure, watching the young man who had walked across dry riverbed only moments earlier beside the greatest prophet of their time. Elisha reached the riverbank and stopped. The water flowed strong again, unbroken. The moment felt like a test, quiet, impossible, holy. He lifted the cloak and struck the water the same way Elijah had. The river split. The waters obeyed. A gasp rose from the prophets, watching on the opposite shore. The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha, they whispered. And as Elisha crossed the river, they came running to him, bowing with respect, awe shining in their eyes. It was the beginning of a new season, not just for Elisha, but for Israel. But while Elisha stepped into his calling, there were still pieces of Elijah's departure that lingered in the nation. Rumors spread. Some of the prophets said, maybe the Spirit of the Lord carried him to a mountain, or a valley, or somewhere far away. They begged Elisha to allow a search party. Elisha shook his head. Don't go. He's gone." But they insisted until he finally allowed it. For 3 days they searched the mountains, the cliffs, the valleys, everywhere a man could possibly be. They found nothing. On the 3rd day they returned, tired and dusty. Elisha nodded quietly. "Didn't I tell you?" But the truth was something deeper, something sacred. Elijah wasn't lost. He wasn't hidden. He wasn't misplaced. He was taken, lifted into heaven in a way that no one else had ever experienced. Only Enoch, long before, had shared such a mystery. Elijah's story didn't end in the wilderness or under a broom tree or on a mountaintop. It ended in the arms of God. Yet his legacy continued through Elisha, who now carried the mantle with strength and humility. Elisha's ministry began immediately. The land was still healing from drought and weakness. The people still struggled with trust. The wars with neighboring nations hadn't fully settled. And the spiritual confusion Jezebel brought still lingered like smoke after fire. The first miracle Elisha performed after receiving the cloak was simple, but powerful. The people of Jericho approached him with a problem. "Our town is beautiful," they said, "but the water is bad, and the land is unfruitful. Nothing grows properly. Our people are sick." Elisha asked for a bowl filled with salt. He walked to the spring that fed the city, lifted his hand, and poured the salt into the water. "Thus says the Lord," he declared, "I have healed this water. It will no longer cause death or barrenness." The spring became clean instantly, sparkling in the sunlight. Life returned to Jericho. And through this miracle, the people saw that Elijah's God was still working through different hands, but the same Spirit. Meanwhile, miles away, Jezebel remained in the palace, her power still trembling through the kingdom, her threats echoing long after Elijah's departure. But her time was approaching, shaped by the very injustice she had built her reign upon. Ahab had already died in battle, pierced by an arrow he never saw coming, a consequence foretold by Elijah years earlier. His son took the throne, but the sickness in Israel's leadership continued, and the shadow of Jezebel lingered. But God had already prepared the one who would confront that final darkness. His name was Jehu, and Elisha, carrying Elijah's mantle, would be the one to anoint him. The story was not over. Elijah's journey had ended in heaven, but his influence still shook the earth through the calling he passed down. And now the path was turning toward the fall of Jezebel, the cleansing of Israel, and the fulfillment of prophecy spoken long before. Elisha had stepped fully into his calling, the cloak of Elijah still draped over his shoulders like a promise he carried everywhere he went. The people of Israel began to sense a new presence, different, yet unmistakably tied to the prophet who had been taken up. Healing, protection, and miracles started to ripple through towns, rivers, and villages as if Elijah's spirit still moved through the land. Word of Elisha's power spread quickly. People from surrounding cities and villages traveled long distance, hoping to witness the man who had walked across the Jordan River on dry ground, who had healed waters, and who carried the mantle of the greatest prophet of their time. But Elisha was not interested in fame. He was interested in obedience, in carrying out God's will, in continuing what Elijah had started. And God gave him challenges immediately. One day, as Elisha was walking near a small village in the northern region, a woman approached him with tear-stained eyes. She carried a small bundle, her son, lifeless in her arms. Her voice quivered as she spoke. "My son, he has no breath. Please help me, servant of God." Elisha's heart ached. He remembered the widow's son that Elijah had raised so many years ago. He knelt beside the boy, placing his hands gently on the child. "Lord, let your spirit work through me," he whispered. The boy stirred. He coughed, then breathed deeply. Life returned. The mother wept, gratitude pouring from her like a river. And in that moment, Elisha understood deeply that the spirit of Elijah was not gone. It was alive in him, in every act of faith and obedience. Meanwhile, Jezebel's shadow continued to darken Israel. Even with Ahab gone, she ruled with cunning and cruelty, determined to maintain her grip over the throne through fear and manipulation. Her army of false prophets still marched through towns, teaching idols, controlling markets, and whispering lies into the ears of kings. God, however, had already begun his plan. Through Elisha, he sent messengers to anoint Jehu as king of Israel. Jehu was a man of bold spirit, ready to strike against the corruption that had poisoned the nation for years. The anointing was not just a ritual, it was a divine mission. Elisha sent one of his students to pour oil over Jehu's head in secret, whispering the words of God. "The Lord has sent me to anoint you king over Israel. Strike down the house of Ahab, for their sins have reached the heavens." Jehu accepted the call, his heart steeled with purpose. He knew that what awaited him would be dangerous, that Jezebel's wrath was legendary. But he also knew that God's Spirit had chosen him for this moment, and he could not falter. Jezebel, upon hearing rumors of Jehu's anointing, grew furious. She summoned her most loyal soldiers and strategized to protect her power. She thought herself invincible, believing that the throne would never slip from her grasp. But God's timing was perfect. Jehu's army struck swiftly. Cities surrendered one by one. Soldiers loyal to Jezebel's corrupt reign fell before the force that carried divine authority. And finally, Jehu approached the palace in Jezreel. Jezebel, seeing the walls breach, adorned herself in her most elaborate clothing, jewels glinting in the sun. She stood at the palace window and shouted threats at the approaching army. But her words fell on deaf ears, for her fate had already been written. When Jehu entered the palace, Jezebel confronted him. She scorned him, taunted him, and mocked the very God he served. But the army pushed forward. Jezebel tried to escape, but she stumbled on the palace steps, her fate sealed. The city watched as justice was executed. Her reign ended in a way that Israel had long awaited. With Jezebel gone, the land began a slow, careful healing. The altars of Baal were torn down. Temples to idols were destroyed. People returned to worshiping God, the one true Lord, guided by prophets who followed the spirit Elijah had first carried. Elisha's role in this was profound. He continued performing miracles that reinforced God's authority. He purified water, fed the hungry, and protected the vulnerable. Each act was a reminder that Elijah's spirit lived on through obedience and faith. One of Elisha's most striking miracles occurred when he was approached by a group of soldiers who were on a mission far beyond their abilities. They feared an enemy force that seemed unstoppable. Elisha prayed, lifting his hands to heaven, calling on the Spirit of God that had been Elijah's and now rested in him. A sudden, powerful wind rose. Confusion struck the enemy camp, and the soldiers returned victorious. This was the essence of Elijah's legacy, God's power moving through those who trusted him completely, even after the prophet himself had left the earth. But even as peace returned, the nation was reminded that the work was never truly finished. There were still battles to fight, still lessons to teach, still hearts to guide back to God. The prophets who followed Elisha learned that their power came not from themselves, but from obedience and faith. And each day, they remembered Elijah, how he had been taken up to heaven, leaving no body, no grave, only a spirit that continued to shape the world. Elisha, walking through the cities, rivers, and mountains of Israel, became a living testament to that truth. He performed miracles not for personal glory, not for fame, but to demonstrate God's love, his power, and his presence among his people. He remembered the lessons Elijah had taught him: courage in the face of kings, patience in the wilderness, trust in the unseen, and obedience even when the path seemed impossible. Through him, God reminded Israel that the covenant still held, that justice would prevail, and that the Spirit of the Lord was alive and active in the world. Even the young prophets who watched these events unfold learned the most important lesson: God's timing is perfect, his justice is inevitable, and his Spirit moves through those who trust completely. Elijah's story had ended in heaven, but his life continued in every act of courage, in every miracle, in every step of faith that Elisha took. The chariot of fire, the parting of the Jordan, the raising of the widow's son, they all became symbols, not of one man's power, but of God's eternal plan. As Israel rebuilt, the people learned to honor God again, not just in grand temples or altars, but in obedience, kindness, and faith. And every time a miracle occurred, every time a life was saved, every time water was purified or the hungry were fed, the story of Elijah echoed, teaching new generations that God works through his chosen, that faith overcomes fear, and that even in the darkest times, hope is never lost. Elisha continued to guide, to teach, to perform miracles. His life intertwined with the past, carrying forward Elijah's spirit while preparing the nation for the future. And through him, the legacy of the prophet who had been taken up to heaven lived on, shining like a flame that could never be extinguished. The land was healing, but the people were learning that obedience, faith, and trust in God were what truly mattered. Elijah's life had not ended. It had transformed into a story of hope, courage, and divine power that would be remembered for generations. And as the sun set over Israel, the memory of Elijah, the prophet who was taken up to heaven, lingered in the hearts of all who believed. Elisha's days were filled with the weight of responsibility. The mantle of Elijah rested on his shoulders, and with it came the expectation of miracle, guidance, and unwavering faith. The people of Israel looked to him not only as a prophet, but as a living testament to God's power, a bridge between heaven and earth. Every village, every city, every small settlement came to understand that God had not abandoned his. One morning, a group of young prophets came running to Elisha with news of a desperate situation. "Master, the king of Moab is plotting against Israel. He has built fortresses along the border and plans to invade." Elisha paused, his eyes scanning the horizon. He remembered Elijah's words, "God's power is perfect, but it works through obedience and faith. Gather all the prophets and the elders," he instructed calmly. "The Lord will provide guidance." The group assembled near the Jordan River. Elisha prayed, lifting his hands to heaven. His voice was steady, carrying the confidence of a man who had seen God's Spirit act in ways no human could control. He stretched his hands over the river. "Watch carefully. The Lord will show his power." As he spoke, the water in the river began to divide, just as it had for Elijah. A dry path opened, allowing the assembly to cross safely. The young prophets gasped, their eyes wide with awe. They had seen miracles, but witnessing the continuation of Elijah's legacy left them humbled and inspired. Once across the river, Elisha led the assembly to strategic positions, teaching them patience and trust. When the Moabite army approached, a miraculous event occurred. God sent confusion among the enemy soldiers. They turned on each other, lost in fear, and soon fled without causing a single casualty. The people of Israel rejoiced, praising God's power. This victory strengthened Elisha's reputation, but it also reminded him of the fragility of human leadership. The nation needed guidance, not just miracles. The hearts of the people had to be nurtured toward obedience and faith, and that task would not be easy. Meanwhile, the stories of Elijah continued to inspire the young prophets who had watched his final days. They shared tales of his courage on Mount Carmel, the raising of the widow's son, the chariot of fire, and his ascension to heaven. Each story reminded them that God's Spirit is greater than any earthly challenge, and that faith can move mountains and split rivers. Elisha made it his mission to train these young prophets, teaching them not only to perform miracles, but also to lead with integrity and humility. He reminded them that power without obedience is dangerous, and that every act must reflect God's will. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, a small group of villagers approached Elisha with a troubling story. A famine had struck their region, crops had failed, and children were starving. The villagers pleaded, "Prophet of God, help us. We have nothing left." Elisha's eyes softened. He remembered how Elijah had once relied on God's provision during a drought, how a widow's household had been sustained by divine promise. He instructed the villagers to gather as much grain and flour as they could find. Then, he blessed the food, praying silently for God's abundance. When they opened the storehouses the next morning, the villagers discovered that the grain and flour had multiplied. There was enough to feed the entire village and even share with neighboring communities. Joy and gratitude filled the air, and the people praised God for his miraculous provision. Elisha's work was not only about miracles, it was about restoring faith and hope. Every life he touched became a living testament to God's power, a continuation of Elijah's legacy. As time passed, Elisha began to prepare the next generation for the responsibilities ahead. He knew that the cycle of leadership must continue, that God's work on earth is eternal, and that each prophet must learn to carry the Spirit faithfully. One day, a group of prophets asked Elisha to recount the story of Elijah's ascension. They gathered around him near the Jordan River, eager to hear the details. Elisha smiled, his eyes reflecting both reverence and awe. "Elijah was a man of courage and faith," he began. "He faced kings, false prophets, and the spiritual decay of our land. But he never wavered in his devotion to God. When the time came, the Lord took him up to heaven in a chariot of fire, and his mantle was passed to me. That moment was not just for me. It was for all of Israel, a sign that God's Spirit is eternal and moves through those who obey him. The young prophets listened intently, understanding the weight of their calling. They realized that miracles were not merely displays of power. They were instruments of God's will, meant to guide, protect, and teach. Elisha's mentorship extended beyond miracles. He taught the prophets to resolve conflicts with wisdom, to lead communities with integrity, and to inspire hope in those who had lost faith. Every lesson was infused with stories of Elijah, ensuring that the legacy of the prophet who had been taken to heaven would continue through generations. One significant event marked Elisha's ministry, the healing of Naaman, a commander of the army of Aram. Naaman suffered from leprosy, a disease that left him isolated and ashamed. When he heard of Elisha's power, he traveled with a delegation to Israel, expecting a grand gesture. Elisha, however, sent a simple message: "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and your flesh will be restored." Naaman initially resisted. He expected fire, dramatic miracles, and elaborate ceremonies, but his servants persuaded him to obey. He stepped into the Jordan and followed the prophet's instruction. On the 7th time, his skin was restored, clean and healthy. Naaman bowed before God, humbled by the simplicity of obedience and the profound power behind it. He returned to his homeland, proclaiming the greatness of God and bringing honor to Israel. Through this act, Elisha demonstrated that faith and humility are as important as miraculous power. Obedience to God, not spectacle, is what brings true transformation. As the years went on, Elisha continued his mission. He performed miracles that healed, protected, and inspired. Rivers were purified, cities were fed, and enemies were confounded. He trained new prophets, ensuring that the Spirit of God remained strong in Israel. The story of Elijah, once ascended to heaven, lived on in every act Elisha performed. It was a story of courage, faith, and divine purpose. It reminded the people that God's power is not limited by human understanding, and that his Spirit works through those who trust and obey. Elisha knew that his time, too, would eventually end. But he also understood that God's plan is eternal. Each prophet, each miracle, each lesson passed down contributed to the larger story of Israel and its covenant with God. And so, with the mantle of Elijah upon him, Elisha walked the land with unwavering faith, knowing that the Spirit of the Lord, once given to a man taken up to heaven, now moved through him, guiding, protecting, and sustaining his people. The legacy of Elijah was no longer confined to one man. It lived on through Elisha, through the prophets, and through every act of faith and obedience in Israel. And as the sun set over the hills, the people of Israel remembered the prophet who had been taken to heaven, their hearts lifted in hope, their spirits renewed, and their faith strengthened by the miraculous story that would endure forever. Elisha's days were long, filled with constant journeys, challenges, and the task of guiding a nation still recovering from corruption and spiritual decay. The mantle of Elijah rested heavily upon him, yet he carried it with humility and devotion. Every action, every word, every step he took was a reflection of the Spirit that had been passed down to him. The people watched, fascinated and inspired, as Elisha continued the work his master had begun. Villages healed, rivers purified, the hungry fed, the sick restored. And yet, not all hearts were ready to accept God's power. False prophets, corrupt officials, and greedy nobles still lingered in the shadows, plotting to undermine what God was building. One day, a troubling report reached Elisha. In a distant region of Israel, a famine persisted despite the rain. Fields lay barren, livestock weakened, and families suffered. The people cried out, hoping for help. Elisha knew he had to act, but this challenge required more than a simple miracle. It required faith, patience, and strategy. He gathered the elders and young prophets and instructed them to assess the land. Look carefully at what remains. Trust the Lord and prepare to follow his instructions, he said. They spread out, walking the countryside, counting the resources, the grain, the water sources, and even the hearts of the people. Elisha prayed, lifting his hands to heaven. His voice carried the weight of faith and authority. Lord, show your mercy. Provide what is needed so your people may survive and continue to honor you. Suddenly, a small spring nearby began to bubble. The water grew, filling streams and nourishing the land. Crops that had been planted sprang to life, yielding more than ever before. Livestock flourished, and families rejoiced. News of this miracle spread quickly, restoring hope to a land that had nearly given up. While Israel was recovering, whispers about Elijah's ascension and Elisha's miracles reached neighboring kingdoms. The king of Aram, curious and uneasy, sent envoys to investigate. "Who is this prophet?" he asked his advisors. "How can one man perform miracles that rival our armies and kings?" The envoys returned with stories of rivers divided, enemies confused, and lives restored. The king of Aram realized that the power behind these acts was not human, it was divine. Fear and respect entered his heart, and he sent gifts as a gesture of peace, acknowledging the God of Israel. Elisha received the envoys with humility, teaching them that the miracles were not for personal glory, but for God's glory. "The Spirit of the Lord moves through those who obey him," he told them. "It is not I, but God who works these wonders." This approach strengthened Israel's reputation across the region. Nations began to recognize the God who works through his prophets, and the influence of Elijah's legacy expanded beyond the borders of Israel. One day, a man approached Elisha with a desperate request. "Prophet of God, my child is gravely ill. I have tried everything, but nothing works. Please help us." Elisha knelt beside the boy, just as Elijah had done long ago. He placed his hands on the child and whispered prayers to God. A warmth spread through the room, and life returned to the boy. The mother wept, overwhelmed with gratitude, and praised God for his mercy. Elisha's reputation grew, but so did the awareness of his responsibilities. He knew that miracles alone could not sustain a nation. People needed leadership, teaching, and spiritual guidance. Every act of healing, every demonstration of power, was a lesson in obedience, faith, and trust in God's timing. As he traveled through Israel, Elisha began training more prophets. He taught them not only how to perform miracles, but how to lead, how to make decisions rooted in faith, and how to maintain humility in the face of success. He reminded them daily of Elijah, the man taken up to heaven, whose spirit now guided them all. During this time, Elisha encountered another significant challenge. The king of Israel had grown weak, relying on advisors and corrupt officials. Meanwhile, Jezebel's influence, though diminished, still lingered through her supporters. Elisha knew he had to act wisely, to bring about justice without unnecessary bloodshed. He instructed his students to anoint Jehu as king, just as he had done years before. Jehu's mission was clear: cleanse the nation of idolatry, restore faith, and enforce justice. With guidance from Elisha, Jehu's leadership brought a renewed sense of order and spiritual revival to Israel. Elisha continued to perform miracles as Jehu carried out his mission. Rivers were purified, food multiplied, enemies confounded, and the sick healed. Each miracle reinforced the authority of God and the legitimacy of Jehu's rule. One day, Elisha traveled to a village near the Jordan River. A group of children approached him, frightened and hungry. Their village had suffered from neglect, and disease had spread among them. Elisha knelt beside the children, comforting them. He prayed for healing, and God answered. The children's health was restored, their hunger satisfied, and hope returned to their families. News of this miracle spread quickly, reinforcing Elisha's reputation as a faithful servant of God and a true continuation of Elijah's spirit. Elisha also reminded the people that miracles are not to be taken for granted. God works through obedience and faith, he said. He blesses those who trust him, but the power is not ours to claim. It belongs to him alone. This teaching resonated with the people. They began to see that the true legacy of Elijah was not just the miracles, but the faith, courage, and obedience that inspired them to trust in God. As time passed, Elisha's influence grew. He became a guiding force for the nation, training prophets, advising kings, and performing miracles that transformed communities. He continued to honor Elijah's legacy, ensuring that the Spirit of the Lord moved through Israel as it had through the prophet taken to heaven. The land slowly healed. Droughts ended, enemies were confounded, and people returned to God. Yet Elisha knew that his work was far from over. Every generation must be taught, every heart must be guided, and every challenge must be met with faith and courage. Elisha often reflected on Elijah, remembering the chariot of fire, the parting of the Jordan, and the words of his mentor. He understood that the true power of God is eternal, moving through those who trust, obey, and carry forward the mission. Through Elisha, Elijah's story continued, alive in the hearts of prophets, in the obedience of kings, and in the faith of every person who witnessed God's power. The Spirit of the Lord, once given to a prophet taken up to heaven, now moved through Israel, shaping its destiny, guiding its people, and ensuring that God's covenant would endure. And as the sun set over the hills, the people of Israel remembered Elijah, their hearts lifted in hope, their faith renewed, and their lives forever changed by the prophet who had been taken to heaven, leaving behind a legacy that would last for generations. Elisha's ministry was growing, and with it, the responsibilities that had once rested solely on Elijah. Every town he visited, every village he passed through, reflected the legacy of his master. Yet, the challenges were constant, spiritual, political, and human. Even with miracles to inspire the people, faith was fragile, and hearts often wavered. One morning, news reached Elisha of a city plagued by famine and disease. The villagers had lost hope. They spoke of despair in hushed tones, believing that God had abandoned them. Elisha felt the weight of their suffering and prayed earnestly, calling upon the spirit of Elijah that now rested upon him. He instructed the people to gather all the grain left in the city. Then, standing before them, he lifted his hands and prayed. Slowly, miraculously, the grain multiplied beyond imagination. The people rejoiced, praising God and recognizing that his power was alive through his prophet. This miracle reminded Elisha that leadership was not just about guiding the faithful, it was about restoring hope to the hopeless. The Spirit of God, once visible through Elijah's chariot of fire, now moved through him, providing comfort, sustenance, and divine intervention. As Elisha's fame spread, even distant nations began to take notice. The king of Aram sent ambassadors to observe the miracle, curious but fearful. How can one man perform wonders that rival our armies? They asked. Elisha welcomed the envoys, but taught them that miracles are never for human pride. The works you have seen are not mine, he said, but God's. Obedience and faith allow his spirit to move, and his power is infinite. Honor him, for it is he who performs these deeds. The envoys returned, amazed and humbled. Their report to the king changed their perspective. Even powerful nations began to acknowledge the God of Israel, and the influence of Elijah's legacy spread beyond Israel's borders. Meanwhile, Elisha faced challenges closer to home. The sons of prophets, newly trained under his guidance, were growing impatient and questioning his methods. Why must we wait? They asked. Why not act immediately? Elisha, patient and wise, gathered them near the Jordan River and told them the story of Elijah's final days. He reminded them how the chariot of fire had taken Elijah to heaven, how the Spirit of God had passed to him, and how patience, faith, and obedience had always been the keys to divine power. Miracles without wisdom are empty, he explained. Power without humility leads to destruction. Watch, learn, and trust. God's Spirit moves in his timing, not ours. The young prophets listened, humbled and inspired. They began to understand that true faith is cultivated through discipline, patience, and unwavering trust in God's plan. One of the most remarkable moments in Elisha's ministry occurred when he was approached by Naaman, a commander of the Aramean army, who had been cured of leprosy years earlier. Naaman returned, bringing gifts and expressing his gratitude, but more importantly, he sought guidance on living a life devoted to God. Elisha advised him, saying, "Serve the Lord faithfully. Obey his commandments and share his blessings with those in need. True service is more valuable than any wealth or title." Naaman took the counsel to heart, becoming an advocate for God's power among his people. Through this act, Elisha's influence extended even beyond Israel, touching hearts and changing lives across borders. Elisha's ministry also involved confronting remaining remnants of Jezebel's influence. Though her reign had ended, her followers continued to spread idolatry and fear. Elisha, guided by the Spirit, addressed these pockets of corruption with courage and wisdom. Through a combination of miracles, teachings, and strategic action, he dismantled the remaining altars of false gods, protected the faithful, and restored trust in God's authority. Each victory, whether large or small, strengthened Israel's spiritual foundation and ensured that the legacy of Elijah continued to flourish. The prophet also continued to mentor the young prophets personally. He emphasized humility, patience, and the importance of serving others. One day, he gathered them by the Jordan River once again. "Remember Elijah," he said. "He was taken by God, leaving no grave, no body, only the Spirit that continues to move through us. That Spirit is our guide, our power, and our purpose. We are instruments, not masters. Obedience, faith, and trust in God will carry you farther than any act of strength alone." The young prophets reflected on these words. They began to understand that miracles were not ends in themselves. They were signs of God's presence and a call to live faithfully. Years passed, and Elisha's ministry became legendary. Villages healed, the land flourished, and Israel gradually restored its spiritual integrity. Leaders learned to consult God through the prophet, and ordinary people witnessed firsthand the power of faith and obedience. Elisha often thought of Elijah, remembering the chariot of fire, the parting of the Jordan, and the lessons that had shaped his life. He knew that his own time would eventually end, but he also understood that God's plan is eternal. Each prophet, each miracle, and each lesson contributed to the larger story of Israel and God's covenant with his people. Elisha's work also emphasized justice. Kings, nobles, and priests were reminded that power must serve righteousness, not selfish ambition. Through guidance, miracles, and wise counsel, Elisha ensured that God's will was carried out, preparing the nation for a future grounded in faith. As Elisha's final years approached, he focused on preparing the next generation. He taught the young prophets to trust in God, to lead with integrity, and to remember that the spirit of Elijah lived within them. Every act of teaching, every miracle performed, every lesson passed on was part of a continuum, a spiritual lineage that connected heaven and earth. The story of Elijah, taken up to heaven, continued to inspire and guide Israel. Through Elisha, the Spirit of God worked miracles, healed the sick, guided kings, and nurtured the faith of the people. The legacy of a prophet who had ascended into heaven became a living, breathing reality in the daily lives of those who believed. And as the sun set over the hills of Israel, Elisha prayed silently, thanking God for the guidance, strength, and spirit passed down from Elijah. He knew that his work, though significant, was only part of God's eternal plan, a plan that would continue through the generations, shaping the nation, the people, and the faith of Israel forever. Elijah's story had begun in the wilderness, faced kings, challenged prophets, and ended in a chariot of fire ascending to heaven. Through Elisha, that story was now lived daily, through obedience, miracles, courage, and unwavering faith. The Spirit of God remained with his people, guiding, healing, and inspiring them, just as he had through Elijah. The nation, the prophets, and the people of Israel knew that the legacy of Elijah was eternal. Though the man was gone, the Spirit remained, moving through every faithful servant, every act of courage, and every miracle performed in God's name. Elisha's life had become a testament to God's enduring power. Every miracle, every lesson, and every act of guidance reminded Israel that the spirit of Elijah was alive and active among them. Yet, Elisha knew that the work of a prophet was never just about one lifetime. It was about creating a chain of faith, obedience, and courage that would continue for generations. The people of Israel had seen rivers parted, lepers healed, the hungry fed, and the sick restored. They had witnessed the power of God move through Elisha just as it had moved through Elijah. The chariot of fire, once seen in the sky, lived on in the spirit that guided each prophet and transformed every life touched by faith. One day, a messenger arrived from a remote village, bringing troubling news. A deadly sickness had spread among the children, leaving parents terrified and communities on edge. Elisha's heart ached. He called the young prophets to him and said, "This is a time for faith, patience, and obedience. God's power will be revealed if we trust and follow his will." They traveled together, carrying prayers and hope. When they arrived, Elisha instructed the villagers to gather the children and bring them to the river. He lifted his hands and prayed, invoking God's spirit that had once worked through Elijah. Slowly, the children's health returned. Color came to their cheeks, strength to their bodies, and joy to their families. The villagers fell to their knees, praising God and recognizing the living presence of his spirit. As the years passed, Elisha continued to mentor the next generation of prophets. He taught them that miracles were powerful, but faith, humility, and obedience were far more important. Elijah's spirit is not limited to chariots of fire or river crossings, he told them. It is alive in every faithful heart, in every act of courage, and in every obedience to God's commands. Through these lessons, the young prophets learned to serve Israel wisely. They healed, taught, and guided, creating a ripple effect of faith that strengthened the nation. Each act of obedience reinforced the legacy of Elijah, ensuring that the Spirit of God remained alive in Israel. Elisha's influence also extended to kings and leaders. He counseled them, guided them, and reminded them that their authority was not for personal gain, but to serve God's people. Through him, Israel experienced both spiritual renewal and practical leadership. Justice, mercy, and faith became intertwined in the governance of the land. One significant event during Elisha's later ministry involved the king of Israel facing an overwhelming enemy army. The people feared defeat, but Elisha reminded them that God's power is greater than any earthly threat. Trust in the Lord, he said, and his Spirit will guide and protect you. Elisha prayed and performed a miracle that confounded the enemy. Horses and chariots became invisible, confusion spread through their ranks, and Israel's soldiers advanced without fear. Victory came not through might, but through the Spirit of God working through obedience and faith. This event became a lasting reminder to the nation. God's protection and power are always available to those who trust him completely. Miracles are not random. They are the result of faith and alignment with his will. Elisha also continued to demonstrate God's care for the vulnerable. One day, a widow approached him with a plea. Her husband had died, leaving debts she could not pay. Elisha instructed her to gather empty vessels from her neighbors and pour the little oil she had into them. Miraculously, the oil multiplied until every vessel was filled, enabling her to pay her debts and sustain her family. Through acts like these, Elisha showed that God's Spirit works in both grand miracles and everyday provision. Elijah's legacy was not just the chariot of fire or the dramatic river crossings. It was the continuous demonstration of God's power and care for his people. Elisha often reflected on Elijah's ascension, remembering the awe and wonder of that day. The fiery chariot, the sky opening, and the Spirit moving into his life were reminders that God's work is eternal. Life and death, kings and prophets, nations and individuals, all are part of God's plan, and his Spirit moves through those who obey and trust him. Even in his old age, Elisha remained active, traveling, teaching, and performing miracles. He knew his time on earth would eventually end, but he focused not on himself, but on the legacy of faith he was leaving behind. He trained prophets who would continue the work, ensuring that Elijah's spirit would endure in Israel for generations. One day, a young prophet asked him, "Master, how can we be sure the Spirit will always guide us?" Elisha smiled and replied, "The Spirit that once lifted Elijah to heaven lives within those who trust God completely. Obedience, faith, courage, and humility keep the Spirit alive. Serve faithfully, and you will witness God's power in ways that surpass understanding." The young prophets listened carefully, realizing that the true legacy of Elijah was not in the chariot, the miracles, or the dramatic ascension. It was in living faithfully, trusting fully, and serving with courage. As Israel prospered, the people remembered the story of Elijah, the prophet who had been taken up to heaven. Mothers told their children of the fiery chariot, fathers recounted the parting of the Jordan, and prophets taught the lessons of faith, courage, and obedience. The nation understood that miracles were signs, but the Spirit that caused them was eternal. Elisha's final years were devoted to reinforcing this understanding. He healed, counseled, and guided, ensuring that the young prophets would continue faithfully after him. Each day, he reminded them that God's work is ongoing and that the spirit of Elijah remains in those who live obediently. Even after his passing, Elisha's teachings and the miracles he performed would ensure that Israel never forgot the power and presence of God. Elijah's legacy had transcended death and ascension. It lived in Elisha, in the prophets, and in the hearts of every person who chose to trust God fully. And so, the story of Elijah, the prophet who was taken up to heaven, continued to echo through Israel. His life had been extraordinary, his miracles unforgettable, but his true gift was the Spirit that moved through Elisha and all the prophets who followed. The Spirit of God, once visible in a fiery chariot, now flowed through rivers, healed the sick, guided kings, fed the hungry, and strengthened the faithful. Elijah's ascension was not an end, it was a beginning. Through Elisha and the generations of prophets who carried the mantle, God's power, guidance, and love continued to transform Israel, ensuring that his presence was never forgotten. And as the sun set one final time over the hills of Israel, the people looked to the heavens, remembered Elijah, and knew that the Spirit of God, eternal and powerful, would always remain with them, guiding, protecting, and inspiring faith for generations to come. The legacy of Elijah, the prophet who was taken up to heaven, was eternal.